let's head straight into our top story this morning. Coming from the United States, the race to the White House is heating up. The Republican National Convention kick-started with the formal nomination of Donald Trump for president and Mike Pence for vice president of the United States. Republicans are leaving no stone unturned in their attempts to woo voters. Donald Trump arrived at Charlotte in North Carolina to address the convention in person. He called the 2020 presidential polls the most important election in U.S. history. He complimented Mike Pence and the U.S. COVID-19 task force as well as their response to the outbreak and said that 1 million more lives would have been lost had the authorities shut down the economy in the U.S. He also took a jibe at his opponent, Joe Biden, for being in support of shutting down the economy to contain the outbreak. Listen in.
We have to win. This is the most important election in the history of our country. This is the most, you know, for a long period of time, I would say, well, 2016, how special was that evening? Was that one of the great? That was one of the great evenings. But we have to be very, very careful, and we have to win. Most of the country is right now doing very, very well. They've done an incredible job. And to have a man sitting on television the other day say, oh, I'd shut it down. Oh, I'd shut it, like it's easy, shut it down. And by the way, when you shut it down, and we did the exact right thing, we shut it down, then we reopened, and that's what we're doing now. We're well into it. We caught them doing some really bad things in 2016. Let's see what happens. We caught them doing some really bad things. We have to be very careful because they're trying it again with this whole 80 million mail-in ballots that they're working on. Sending them out to people that didn't ask for them. They didn't ask, they just get them. And it's not fair, and it's not right, and it's not going to be possible to tabulate, in my opinion.
Now, for more insights on the Republican National Convention, our correspondent Jagriti Dave joins us live from Washington, D.C. Thanks for joining us, Jagriti. Now, it is time for the spotlight to shift to the Republicans and, of course, to Donald Trump. His opening remarks were quite dark as he attacked the Democrats for using COVID-19 to steal the election, and I'm obviously quoting him here. So how have his opening remarks been perceived in the U.S.?
Well, his critics, of course, have described those comments as inflammatory. He claimed with no evidence that mail-in voting is subject to fraud. It's something that he said time and time again, and there is no evidence to show that there is widespread election fraud. Studies have shown that there is no evidence. But he has also made false accusations that the Democrats are trying to rig the election using COVID-19 to get people to use mail-in ballots, which he claims will make it easier for people to vote for Joe Biden, which again is unsubstantiated. They are false claims. So yes, critics have criticised him, but you know, he was speaking to with an audience, which was one of the things that was different from the Democratic convention. You could hear his supporters cheering him on and applauding him. So you know, those who are who form part of the president's base clearly support the stance that the president's taking, but there are people who say that the tone that the president took was quite a dark tone, considering that only last week he'd criticised the Democrats for what he said was a dark and gloomy tone to their convention, outlining the negative view of America, and he and his campaign officials promising to put forward a more optimistic vision for the country.
Right. Now, tell us a little bit about what we can expect from this night at the RNC. The theme this year, of course, is the Land of Promise. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, as I say, this is an attempt by the Trump campaign to put division markers between themselves and the Democrats. They've obviously watched the Democrat convention and you know, seen what works, what doesn't work, seen those attack lines, those rebukes, a chance to really come back against those criticisms that the Democrats made on his record on the coronavirus pandemic, on the economy, for example. And so what we've been hearing is the convention opened with a young man from a conservative organisation called Turning Point. It's a group of young conservatives who support President Trump, and he came out with lines like President Trump is the bodyguard of Western civilization. And we've heard from ordinary people, akin to what we saw with the Democrats, the president talking to ordinary people, I guess an attempt to maybe show his softer side. We heard a lot about how great Joe Biden is with ordinary people, and the Republicans clearly wanting to show, well, President Trump has this affinity with people as well. So we heard from ordinary people like truckers, postal workers, and a nurse who was really cheering on the president and his administration's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. So the pandemic has actually interestingly come front and centre in the convention so far. Really, sort of a lot of presenting an optimistic presentation of the handling, or the administration's handling of the pandemic. Lots of criticisms of China. Those are the sorts of things that we're hearing today. We're going to hear from Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, later on in the day, as well as Nikki Haley, former ambassador to the UN. And we're going to hear from other speakers, lots of other members of his family later on in the week as well.
Right. That actually brings me to my next question. The focus of the night will be on the coronavirus outbreak and, of course, the Trump administration's handling of the same. So is he going to use the pandemic as a way to attract more voters, as well as his stronger stand against China?
Well, this is the thing. What's going to be interesting in this convention is how he is going to attract those people who who are independent voters, who are floating voters. You know, it's the president's base is going to support him no matter what. But it's those people who might be considering voting Republican but aren't quite sure. Is the president going to reach out to them? And this optimistic vision of the pandemic, this criticising of China, this is very much the sort of rhetoric that we've heard that really appeals to his base. It'll be interesting to see if and how this works for those voters who are maybe in the middle and undecided.
Now, another issue that is definitely going to play a major role in the upcoming election is, of course, the fallout of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, many speakers tonight have blamed Democrats for ignoring the plight of black Americans. And in fact, just recently, an NFL star said that I've seen racism up and close, and it isn't Donald Trump. So tell us more about the same.
So both parties are clearly responding to the protests that have swept across America in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, an unarmed black man in Minneapolis. And whilst Joe Biden and the Democrats see themselves as reaching out and part of the conversation about reforming the police, for example, the president, and of course with the appointment of Kamala Harris as the first black woman and the first South Asian woman on a major party ticket, there's some competition that they put forward for the Republicans. How do the Republicans respond to this moment in America's history? And what we're seeing a lot of African-American lawmakers coming out and defending President Trump, talking about their experiences with him. It'll be interesting to see how much both parties, how much their approaches work with the African-American communities within the United States. Of course, African-Americans, like all minorities, are not a homogenous group. They have different views, different experiences, different opinions. But it's interesting that it's clear for the Republicans that they need to target African-American voters and try and win them over as an important part of their election strategy.
Right. Now, just wrapping up our discussion here, more than 24 former Republican lawmakers announced that they are in fact endorsing Joe Biden for president. So what does this say about Trump's popularity?
Well, it's interesting. In the opening speech made by Charlie Kirk from Turning Point, he talked about elites from both parties having not acted in the service of ordinary Americans. And this is really part of that whole idea that we saw in 2016 about Donald Trump being the outsider, that he's not a party, he's not a political insider, he's not an old school Republican. And this is how he is trying to present himself, that the old guard, the elites, don't like him because he's trying to shake things up. Right. And that is clearly the spin that the convention is trying to put on the fact that we're hearing from these former Republican lawmakers who've gone over and professing their support for Joe Biden. Some of this might be water off a duck's back for Donald Trump. He's not bothered by those people who he knows didn't have his support in the first place. But as I said before, it's interesting because the president and his campaign really need to see if they can win over those undecided voters. And it'll be interesting to see what their strategy for that is going to be, given that the Democrat strategy was to try to appeal to those Republicans who don't like Donald Trump to come over to them. And the Democrats have their own balancing act to play with the left of the party and those Republicans that they want to woo over. What will the Republican strategy be to get those undecided voters?
Right, absolutely. All right, Jagriti, thank you so much for joining us and for all your inputs on this story. And we'd just like to remind our viewers that we'll be tracking the Republican National Convention closely, and we'll get you all the updates.